Why did no one stop him? The sergeant's hand closed around her collar like a vice, yanking her forward, slamming her into the dirt with the casual cruelty of a man who knew no one dared intervene. Mud splashed across her face, soaking through her fatigues, and for a moment the world went silent, except for the thud of her body hitting the ground. The recruits around her didn't move. They never did. Some smirked, others looked away. Everyone had learned that silence was safer than resistance. What was one more humiliation, one more display of dominance compared to the wrath of Sergeant Kestrel Varga? For 3 weeks Lyric Blackwood had endured this. The barking insults, the deliberate extra weight in her rucksack, the push-ups in the mud until her arms gave out. She bore it all without complaint, without protest, without flinching. But as she lay there, her face pressed into the cold earth, something shifted behind her steady eyes. A flicker, dangerous, controlled, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. She rose without a word, wiping mud from her cheek, her movements calm, efficient, almost mechanical. Varga sneered. Pathetic. This is what weakness looks like. This is what happens when you don't belong. He moved on, his boots splashing through puddles, barking at the next recruit in line. The circle of onlookers dissolved back into formation. Only Lyric remained still, breathing evenly, the taste of iron and soil lingering on her tongue. No one asked if she was all right. No one ever did. Dawn had broken over Fort Blackwood in cold sheets of rain, soaking the recruits lined up in rigid attention. 24 of them. Already worn down, already wondering who would quit before the week was out. They'd been up since 400, running, hauling, breaking themselves on obstacles that didn't care whether you were rich or poor, male or female, born for the uniform or not. But Fort Blackwood wasn't like other training facilities. It prided itself on being the harshest, a 70% dropout rate, a reputation for producing the kind of soldiers who could be dropped into hell and claw their way back out. And in that grim formation stood Lyric Blackwood. She didn't stand out, not physically, not in a way that made sense to the others. At 5'5", slender, with no imposing bulk to her frame, she looked ordinary beside broad-shouldered recruits with the kind of presence that filled a room. Yet there was something about her stillness, something that made her seem apart even when she stood shoulder to shoulder with them. While others flinched under Varga's verbal fire, Lyric remained impassive, detached. Varga noticed, he always noticed. "Blackwood," he roared, stopping inches from her face. His breath smelled of stale coffee and the bitterness of a man who lived on authority. "You're standing like you're waiting for afternoon tea. This isn't a finishing school. This is war." For a fraction of a second, Lyric's eyes flickered. Not to Varga, not to the mud around her boots. Somewhere else. A chandelier, the gleam of polished marble, the hush of silk dresses in a diplomatic ballroom. She saw a man in a crisp uniform slip something beneath a table while voices murmured in false laughter. The memory dissolved as quickly as it came. "Yes, Sergeant," she replied quietly, her voice even without tremor. Behind her, recruits stifled laughter. Orion Tavish, tall, strong, privileged, leaned toward his bunkmate and whispered, "$10 says she's gone before the week's out." The day's punishment began with the obstacle course. Walls slick with rain, pits of mud, barbed wire scraping against helmets as recruits crawled through. One by one they hauled themselves over, swung across, pushed their bodies to the edge. Lyric tried, harder than most. Her hands blistered on the rope as she climbed, her arms trembling with every inch. The burn became unbearable. She slid down, rope tearing her palms raw. She hit the ground with a thud. "Pathetic Blackwood," Varga's voice cut through the rain like a whip. "My grandmother climbs faster, and she's been dead 15 years. The recruits snickered, not at her, not really, at the relief that they weren't the target this time. Lyric didn't respond. She simply picked herself up, adjusted her grip, and moved on to the next station. There was no fire in her reaction, no protest, only the steady, relentless persistence of someone who refused to quit, even if no one understood why. That night the mess hall buzzed with exhausted voices. Trays of gray rations clattered on metal tables. Recruits huddled in groups, finding comfort in numbers. Lyric sat alone, eating slowly, methodically. She always did. When the last tables filled, two women hesitated before sitting across from her, Juniper Frost and Everly Quinn. Neither had spoken much to Lyric before. Curiosity pushed them forward tonight. "So what's your story, Blackwood?" Juniper asked. Her tone wasn't cruel, just curious. "You don't exactly scream military material." Lyric looked up. Her eyes tracked a lieutenant passing through the hall before returning to her tray. "Just wanted to serve," she said simply. Everly frowned. "Most people with doctorates don't suddenly enlist, they become officers." Lyric's fork froze midair, just slightly, barely noticeable. "What makes you think I have a doctorate?" Everly shrugged. "The way you talk, the vocabulary you use when you forget to dumb it down, the books you read when you think no one's looking." Lyric smiled faintly. Non-committal, she didn't answer. She just asked, "How are you finding training so far?" The subject shifted. The conversation moved to safer ground. But the look exchanged between Juniper and Everly was clear. They weren't fooled. Later in the barracks, Lyric treated her blistered hands in silence. Antiseptic, tape, precise, practiced movements, a soldier's care, or perhaps something older, something learned long before Fort Blackwood. As she reached into her bag, a folded letter slipped free. She caught it quickly, but not quickly enough. Juniper, returning from the bathroom, caught the name on the envelope. Dr. L. Blackwood, Department of Linguistics. Juniper said nothing, but suspicion confirmed itself in her eyes. The next morning, Varga stalked the firing range. The air reeked of oil and gunpowder as recruits lined up. "Blackwood," he barked, "your stance looks like you're posing for a magazine. This isn't a photo shoot." Dozens of eyes turned, waiting for her to fail. Lyric adjusted slightly. "Like this, Sergeant?" she asked softly. Her stance improved, a little, enough to show she could fix it, not enough to satisfy. "No," Varga exaggerated his correction, showing the recruits how an unteachable soldier needed to be handled. "Has anyone ever told you you're hopeless, Blackwood?" "Not that I recall, Sergeant," she replied evenly. But her eyes met his, calm, unyielding, not a challenge but not surrender either. For the first time, Orion Tavish, the recruit who had bet against her survival, felt uneasy. Something about her didn't add up. 3 weeks in, the platoon marched through a storm. Mud sucked at their boots, packs weighing heavy on their backs. Varga carried only a light load, shouting commands as recruits staggered under 60 pounds. Orion faltered, his ankle twisted in the sludge. He stumbled, about to fall. Lyric's hand shot out, subtle, quick. She steadied him just long enough for him to recover. Varga noticed instantly. "Blackwood, you think this is a charity run? Drop 50 push-ups right now." She obeyed without hesitation. Into the mud, perfect form, 1, 2, 3. The platoon kept marching. She caught up after, her face unreadable. "Thanks," Orion muttered when she fell back into step beside him. "No," she said simply. "We're a unit, that's what we do." The words were textbook, but the tone something deeper, something that made Orion wonder if she was testing him. That afternoon, the real test began. Hand-to-hand combat. The recruits formed a circle in the rain. Mud turned the ground into a slick arena. Varga smiled, not kindly but cruelly. Blackwood, front and center. The circle closed. Anticipation buzzed. They all knew how this ended. Or so they thought. How much humiliation could one soldier take before breaking? The recruits circled tighter, rain dripping from helmets and noses, mud soaking fatigues. No one dared speak, but every glance said the same thing: this wasn't training. This was spectacle. Varga was going to break her in front of everyone. Lyric stepped forward calm, her boots sinking into the sludge, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture still. She gave no sign of dread, no signal of defiance, just that same unreadable stillness. 3 weeks, Varga bellowed, his voice carrying across the soaked yard. 3 weeks and you still move like a civilian. Maybe you should have stayed in whatever soft little life you came from. A ripple of nervous laughter flickered through the crowd. Not joy, not mockery, relief. Relief that they weren't the target. Lyric said nothing, but for just a breath her mind drifted, not to the mud, not to Varga's looming presence, but to a shadowed corridor in another life. The hiss of radios. Her breath steady as she disarmed a man twice her size, her hands moving with practiced speed. A voice in her ear, calm and certain. Mission complete, Agent Blackwood. Then the memory was gone. Eyes on me, Varga barked. He lunged, seizing her collar, slamming her down with his full weight. The mud erupted beneath her, water splattering across her face, her back. The impact jarred her ribs, the air forced from her lungs. Gasps broke through the circle. Some recruits looked away. Others smirked, uncomfortable but unwilling to risk showing it. Varga planted his boots beside her, looming triumphant. This, he roared, voice echoing through the storm, is weakness. This is what happens when you don't belong. The words hung heavy. Rain hammered down. For a heartbeat, Lyric's body stayed motionless, her cheek pressed into the mud. Then her eyes opened. The docile recruit was gone. In her gaze burned something cold, sharp, honed by years unseen. A switch had flipped. Her hand shot out like lightning, fingers clamping around Varga's ankle. A precise pressure point, one most soldiers didn't even know existed. Pain tore up his leg, his stance faltering. And then impossibly she moved. In one fluid motion, she swept his supporting leg while twisting her body, using leverage where brute strength would have failed. Varga, 200 pounds of trained muscle, crashed into the mud with a force that splattered a 6-foot circle. Silence. Even the rain seemed to pause. Before he could recover, before his mind could even process what had happened, Lyric had him immobilized, his arm locked, his weight neutralized, her control absolute. Her voice carried, calm, steady. First rule of combat assessment, Sergeant. Never underestimate your opponent based on appearance. She released him instantly. The moment her grip loosened, she stepped back, rising to her feet. At attention, mud dripping from her uniform but her composure flawless. The circle of recruits froze. Orion's mouth hung open. Juniper's eyes darted between Varga and Lyric in disbelief. Everly's hands tightened at her sides. Varga rose slowly. His face was a storm, humiliation, rage, confusion. His mouth opened, ready to unleash the kind of tirade that could end careers, when a voice cut clean through the rain. "That's enough, Sergeant Varga." Every head turned. Colonel Thaddeus Wren stepped forward, silver hair plastered by rain, his presence commanding without effort. No one had seen him arrive. No one had even realized he'd been watching. "Sir," Varga stammered, "I saw precisely what you were doing," Wren interrupted, his tone quiet but carrying more authority than a shout ever could. "And I believe Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood has made her point." The words struck like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the formation. Confusion, shock, disbelief, Lieutenant Colonel. Lyric's eyes didn't move. Her posture didn't change. She simply waited. Wren addressed the recruits directly. "What you've just witnessed may be the most valuable lesson of your time here. You've been told strength looks like this." He gestured to Varga, broad, imposing. "But strength wears many forms. Lieutenant Colonel Lyric Blackwood is one of our most decorated intelligence operatives. For 3 weeks, she has endured what you endured and more to assess the effectiveness of our training methods." Murmurs surged, barely contained. Juniper's breath caught. Everly's suspicion confirmed. Orion felt a hollow pit form in his chest, recalling every smirk, every doubt. Ren's voice cut through. Remember this. Brute strength alone will not win the battles ahead. The wars of tomorrow demand soldiers who observe, adapt, endure, and wait for the precise moment to act. Varga stood frozen, the realization settling like lead. For 3 weeks he'd tried to break her, and she had let him, not out of weakness but strategy. Ren turned to him. Sometimes the strongest soldiers are not the ones who shout the loudest, Sergeant. They're the ones who let silence carry them until the truth can't be denied. The recruits held their breath. No one dared move. Lyric, still at attention, gave no sign of triumph, no hint of smugness, only composure. Ren's gaze swept the formation one last time. Mark this day, it will be remembered. And then he walked away, his presence lingering even after he was gone. Varga stood alone in the circle, drenched, humiliated, silent. The recruits dispersed slowly, stunned, as if afraid the mud itself might shatter if they moved too quickly. Whispers spread like wildfire. She's an officer, she's intelligence. She let him do it for weeks. Lyric returned to the barracks that night in silence. She packed her small belongings into a bag. Her mission here was nearly complete. By morning, she would return to her real duties. But as the door creaked open, Juniper and Everly appeared, awkward, hesitant. "May we come in, ma'am?" Juniper asked, the word heavy on her tongue. Lyric looked up, nodded once. "You don't have to call me that when we're alone." They stepped inside cautiously. The air was thick, as though the world had shifted beneath their feet. "You could have put him down any day," Juniper said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "Why did you wait?" Lyric folded a shirt with deliberate care. "Because this was never about Sergeant Varga, it was about all of you." They frowned, uncertain. She continued, "The military has become obsessed with aggression, with brute force. But that isn't the only kind of strength. Resilience, strategy, emotional intelligence. These are what win wars now. The enemy doesn't always march in uniform. Sometimes they sit across from you in a ballroom, smiling, waiting. If we don't see that, we lose." Everly swallowed. "So that's what you do, intelligence." Lyric's smile was faint. "Let's just say, I've learned my skills are useful in certain contexts." Juniper glanced at Everly, then back at Lyric. "So what happens now?" "Now," Lyric said, her voice steady, "things change, training protocols, evaluations, respect for the ones who don't fit the mold. The next generation won't have to prove themselves the way I did." The room fell quiet, and in that silence, a shadow appeared in the doorway. Sergeant Varga, freshly showered, uniform sharp, his face unreadable. For a long moment he stood, neither sneering nor barking. Then he straightened his spine and raised a crisp, perfect salute. "Colonel Blackwood," he said formally, "I request permission to review your findings, to become a better instructor." The room froze. Lyric studied him carefully, past the bluster, past the pride, to the soldier beneath, a man who, for all his flaws, still believed in service. She returned the salute with equal precision. "Approved, Sergeant. We begin tomorrow." What happens when humiliation turns into respect? The morning after the fight, the barracks buzzed like a hive. Whispers passed from bunk to bunk. The woman they thought was weakest had been an officer all along. Not just an officer, a decorated intelligence operative. Some felt betrayed, others awed, all of them unsettled. Lyric sat at the edge of her cot, lacing her boots in silence. She neither confirmed nor denied anything. She didn't need to. The truth already had its own weight. By mid-morning, she was summoned to the officers' quarters. The room was quiet, sterile, heavy with unspoken judgment. Colonel Ren sat at the head of a long table, several senior instructors arrayed along the sides. Their expressions were a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and unease. Ren gestured for her to sit. "Lieutenant Colonel Blackwood, your demonstration yesterday effective, though more dramatic than I anticipated. Lyric folded her hands on the table, her posture composed. Sometimes clarity requires drama, sir. A faint smile tugged at the corner of Wren's mouth. Indeed. But not everyone shared his amusement. General Harper, the highest-ranking officer present, leaned forward, his voice sharp. Colonel Wren tells us you embedded yourself in basic training, subjected yourself to conditions well beneath your rank. For what purpose, exactly? To test the integrity of our training protocols, Lyric replied evenly. You humiliated one of our senior instructors in front of his recruits. Harper's tone hardened. Do you consider that a test? Lyric met his gaze without flinching. I consider it a necessary correction. Sergeant Varga's methods reflect a broader flaw in our system. We filter out potentially valuable recruits because we equate strength with size and volume. We're producing warriors for yesterday's wars, not tomorrow. Murmurs circled the table. One instructor scoffed under his breath. Another shifted uncomfortably. Wren raised a hand for silence. Blackwood, outline your findings. Lyric tapped her tablet. A projection flickered to life, displaying charts, metrics, field reports. Her voice was calm, measured. Our dropout rate eliminates 70% of recruits. Of those, 40% displayed cognitive or adaptive skills that could have been assets in modern operations. These recruits were lost because they didn't fit a narrow physical profile. She swiped, displaying data from recent missions. In every successful, unconventional operation, adaptability outweighed brute force. Soldiers who improvised, who read patterns others missed, made the difference. We're discarding them before they're tested. The room was silent. Finally, Harper asked, "And what do you recommend?" "A complete overhaul of evaluation metrics," Lyric said without hesitation. "Integrate cognitive and psychological assessments alongside physical testing. Train instructors to recognize subtle strengths. And most importantly," she paused, letting the silence weigh, "shift the culture. The loudest voice isn't always the strongest." Her words lingered, some faces softened, others hardened. Wren nodded slowly, concise, necessary, convincing. But Harper's expression remained rigid. "Colonel, you propose reforms that will upend decades of tradition. Do you understand the resistance you'll face?" "Yes, sir." "And you still believe it's worth the risk?" Lyric's eyes were steady. "I've lived the risk. I've seen what happens when the wrong people are chosen for the wrong reasons. The cost of tradition is blood we don't need to lose." The silence that followed was heavier than before. At last Wren stood. "Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel, that will be all for now." Lyric gathered her tablet, nodded respectfully and left the room. The door shut behind her. Inside, murmurs rose again. Harper leaned toward Wren. "She's right about one thing. This will be war inside our own ranks." Wren's response was quiet but certain. "Then it's a war worth fighting." But that afternoon, Lyric found herself face to face with Sergeant Varga in a small conference room. The man stood rigid, his discomfort obvious, but something different lingered in his eyes. Not just shame, not just wounded pride, determination. "Thank you for coming, Sergeant," Lyric said, setting aside the formality of her rank. Varga's jaw flexed. "I owe you an apology, ma'am. My behavior was unprofessional." "This isn't about apologies," she replied softly. "It's about evolution. The battlefield has changed. Our training must change with it." For 2 hours, they reviewed footage of the last 3 weeks. Lyric paused at key moments. A recruit struggling under weight but improvising leverage. Another failing a run but mapping shortcuts instinctively. Patterns Varga had missed because he'd been looking for something else. "What do you see here?" she asked, pointing to a recruit failing to carry heavy equipment. "Failure," Varga said automatically. "Look closer." He watched again. The recruit tied her belt around the load, dragged it with reduced weight, finished the course bruised but standing. Varga's brow furrowed. She improvised. Problem solving, Lyric corrected gently. The kind of thinking that saves lives when plans collapse, but under our system she'd wash out. Varga sat back, silent. The images replayed in his mind, faces of recruits he had dismissed, voices of soldiers who might have become something more. Finally he exhaled. We're missing them, the quiet ones, the thinkers, the ones who don't look like soldiers but fight like them where it counts. Yes, Lyric said simply, and it's not your fault alone. The system was built this way, but you can help change it. He met her eyes. For once there was no defiance, no wall of pride, only a question. Where do we start? You tell me, she said. You know this facility better than anyone. He thought for a long moment. The instructors changed their mindset first, then the recruits. Lyric allowed herself the faintest smile. Exactly what I was thinking. By the end of the week, whispers of change had spread across Fort Blackwood. Instructors gathered in small rooms discussing new evaluation protocols. Some resisted outright, scoffing at soft approaches. Others listened, unsettled but curious. And then Varga spoke. I was wrong, he admitted before them all. His voice didn't tremble, though the admission was heavier than any pack he had carried. For years, I trained soldiers for wars already past. Colonel Blackwood showed me the future in about 5 seconds flat on my back in the mud. If I can change, so can you. Uneasy laughter rippled through the room, but the message landed. In the training yard, recruits noticed the difference. Exercises shifted, new challenges introduced, scenarios that tested wit and teamwork, not just muscle. Juniper excelled in tactical mapping. Everly's memory became an asset in intelligence drills. Even Orion, whose strength had carried him until now, struggled with the new metrics and found himself humbled. I don't get it, he muttered after a failed strategy test. I've always been on top, now I'm barely keeping up. Lyric's voice was calm. Because you've always measured strength in one dimension, now you're being asked to grow. He frowned, so what do I do? Adapt. The best leaders know when to lead and when to follow. For the first time, Orion understood. Change had begun, but change is never simple. And beyond Fort Blackwood's rain-soaked gates, shadows stirred. Not everyone wanted the definition of strength rewritten. How far could change go before it broke the system meant to protect them? By the second week, the training yard felt different. The rain still fell, the mud still clung to boots, the punishment still came swift and harsh, but beneath it something was shifting. Recruits once overlooked found themselves rising. Juniper Frost, whose slight frame had made her a target for Varga's scorn, now commanded tactical drills with startling precision. Her ability to read terrain and predict movements outpaced recruits twice her size. Everly Quinn, quiet but sharp, became indispensable during intelligence scenarios. She recalled details others missed, the placement of a hidden device, the exact wording of a coded message. Even Orion Tavish, golden boy of privilege and strength, stumbled. For the first time, his muscles weren't enough. Strategy drills left him frustrated, breathless not from exertion but from failure. I don't understand, he admitted after yet another exercise where Juniper had outmaneuvered him. I've never been this far behind. Lyric's response was simple. Then you're finally learning. The words stung, but they landed. Varga's transformation was more surprising than any recruit's. Once the embodiment of brute force, he now walked the training fields with new eyes. He still demanded excellence, his voice still thundered, his punishments still cut deep, but his definitions of strength had broadened. A recruit struggling under a heavy load once would have been dismissed as weak. Now, when she rigged a pulley system from belts and straps to shift her pack's weight, Varga paused, studied, then barked loud enough for all to hear. Resourceful. That's how you survive when the battlefield doesn't care about your pride. The recruits froze, stunned. The man who once punished weakness now praised ingenuity. Change was taking root. But change never comes without enemies. Colonel Wren watched from the observation platform, his expression unreadable as Lyric joined him. Below, recruits executed a complex team drill, combining tactical maneuvers with problem-solving under pressure. "They're different," Wren murmured, "cohesive, adaptive." Lyric nodded. "This is what tomorrow's wars will demand." Wren's gaze lingered on her, and tomorrow's wars have already begun. He handed her a sealed folder. The weight of it was more than paper: orders, reports, opposition. Inside, she found memos from high command. General Hargrove, a name that carried iron in the halls of power, had raised formal objections. His words were blunt. "These reforms are soft, dangerous, a risk to national security." Lyric closed the folder slowly. "So it begins." Wren's voice was quiet. "They're not just questioning the program, they're questioning you." She felt no surprise, only the familiar heaviness of being in the crosshairs. "I've been questioned before, and I've survived worse than words." Wren studied her profile. Rain streaked down her uniform, but her expression didn't waver. "This won't be a clean fight. No battlefield, no clear enemy, just politics, perception, power. Are you prepared for that?" Lyric's answer was steady. "I don't fight for myself. I fight for the ones who will never be chosen unless someone rewrites the rules." Wren exhaled, almost a sigh. "Then let's prepare, because they will come for you." That night the recruits pushed through a night march. The forest swallowed their formation, mud sucking at their boots, fog thickening around their heads. It wasn't just about endurance anymore. Hidden along the trail were traps, riddles, coded signals, layers of complexity that once would have been dismissed as unnecessary. Juniper spotted the first trap before anyone else. Orion, still stubborn, tried to muscle through a barrier until Lyric's voice cut in, soft but certain. "Look again, Tavish. You're not breaking through, you're supposed to bend." He stopped, looked. For the first time he saw the faint markers on the rope, the hidden latch disguised in mud. He adjusted, released it, and the barrier fell without force. They moved on, together. Back at camp, Orion sat by the fire, staring at his hands. "I've been doing it wrong all along, haven't I?" Lyric didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stretch, the fire crackling between them. Then she said quietly, "Not wrong, just incomplete. Strength without thought is as fragile as thought without courage." Orion nodded slowly, the words settling heavier than any lecture could. Meanwhile, in a briefing room far from the mud and rain, General Hargrove slammed a report onto a table. "This is folly," he growled to the assembled officers. "War isn't won by philosophy. It's won by soldiers who can carry their wounded, who can crush the enemy before they're crushed themselves. What Blackwood is building is weakness disguised as reform." A younger officer dared to speak. "Sir, the data shows increased completion rates. Recruits once discarded are excelling." "Completion rates," Hargrove spat. "Statistics don't win battles, men do, and this experiment will get them killed." His words were law to many, his influence heavy, and in his sights Lyric Blackwood was already marked. Back at Fort Blackwood, Varga approached Lyric during dawn drills. His voice was low, almost uncertain. "They won't forgive you for humiliating me, you know. Not the old guard, not the generals who think like I did." Lyric didn't look at him. She watched the recruits instead, sweating through a puzzle drill that forced them to think and move as one. "I didn't humiliate you," she said softly. "You humiliated yourself by refusing to see. I just held up the mirror." Varga flinched slightly, then nodded. "And I saw." He hesitated before adding, "But if you're right, if this program spreads, you'll make enemies you can't throw into the mud. What then?" Lyric's answer was calm, resolute. "Then I'll do what I always do, endure, adapt, and wait for the precise moment to act." Weeks passed. The new program hardened. Recruits once destined to wash out thrived. The unit became something rare, not a hierarchy of dominance but a web of strengths, each one feeding the other. Colonel Wren saw it. Varga saw it. Even Orion, once certain of his superiority, saw it. But outside Fort Blackwood, storms gathered. Rumors spread through command. Blackwood was softening the military. Blackwood was undermining tradition. Blackwood was dangerous. And soon, the whispers became official. General Hargrove himself would arrive at Fort Blackwood. To watch, to judge, to dismantle. Lyric stood at the edge of the training yard as word spread, recruits murmuring, instructors unsettled. The sky above stretched gray, heavy with rain. Her eyes narrowed. She had fought in shadows, in silence, in mud, but this would be different. The enemy now wore polished stars. And they would not underestimate her, not this time. What happens when strength is forced to prove itself on a stage built for its failure? The day of the final qualification exercise dawned gray and brittle. The rain had finally broken, leaving the ground slick but the air sharp with expectation. Recruits stood in formation, nerves running through their veins like electricity. This wasn't just another drill. This was the test that would decide whether the changes Lyric Blackwood fought for could survive. From the observation platform above, General Hargrove stood rigid, his uniform immaculate, his chest heavy with medals earned across decades of wars fought the old way. His eyes were cold, skeptical, the look of a man who believed the future could never improve upon the past. Colonel Wren stood beside him, calm but alert, and just behind Lyric waited, still, silent, watching. "This is highly irregular," Hargrove muttered, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. "Combat effectiveness cannot be measured with games." Wren's reply was steady. "With respect, sir, this is far from a game. It is a scenario designed to integrate every skill modern warfare demands." Hargrove didn't turn his head. His jaw clenched, his eyes locked on the recruits below. "War is force meeting force, Colonel. Always has been, always will be." Lyric spoke for the first time, her voice measured, carrying just enough weight to demand attention without arrogance. "Perhaps, General, but the force that adapts first always wins." Hargrove's eyes flicked to her briefly, narrowing. Then he said nothing. The horn blared. The exercise began. The recruits moved into the mock urban environment constructed across the training field. Broken walls, staged civilians, hidden threats. The old system would have demanded one thing: breach and clear, overwhelming force, casualties be damned. But this time was different. Juniper Frost led the perimeter unit, her spatial awareness guiding them to cover angles others would have missed. Everly Quinn tapped into digital feeds, intercepting coded transmissions that revealed hidden ambush points. Orion Tavish, humbled but learning, coordinated the assault team, his voice steady, his commands no longer fueled by ego but by precision. A simulated hostage situation unfolded inside the compound. Tradition demanded they storm the building. Instead, they paused. A slender recruit, one Varga once would have broken on the first day, stepped forward, speaking into a comm device. Her words were measured, calm. Negotiation. "What are they doing?" Hargrove snapped, his voice sharp with irritation. "They're wasting time." "They're gathering intelligence," Wren explained evenly, "reducing risk before committing force. War doesn't wait for diplomacy." Lyric's eyes remained on the recruits. "Sometimes," she said softly, "it does." The negotiator kept the hostage-takers occupied long enough for Everly to intercept their patterns, enough for Juniper to pinpoint vulnerabilities in their positions. When the breach came, it was surgical, swift, precise, minimizing chaos. The hostages were secured, 0 casualties. The observers on the platform shifted, murmurs rising. Even Hargrove's aides, hardened officers themselves, looked grudgingly impressed. But Hargrove's face didn't move. Controlled environment, it proves nothing. Real combat is chaos. Lyric turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes. Then let's add chaos. Her signal was almost imperceptible. Down below, the second phase of the exercise activated. Communications dropped. Civilian interference appeared where none had been expected. Random variables triggered without warning. The recruits froze for only a second. Then they adapted. Teams reformed on the fly. Orders shifted mid-stride. Mistakes were made, corrected, adjusted. Juniper spotted a hidden flanking maneuver. Orion abandoned the front line to cover her position, sacrificing his role as leader to protect the unit. Everly rerouted intelligence manually, piecing fragments together in real time. They bent again, but they never broke. From above, even Hargrove leaned forward slightly, his hands gripping the rail as the recruits neutralized every threat with resilience, intelligence, and control. Wren's voice was calm but weighted. That's what this program builds, General. Soldiers who don't just react, they think. They endure. Hargrove's lips tightened. He said nothing. By the end of the exercise, the field was quiet. The recruits regrouped, battered but standing. Not one casualty, not one failure. Hargrove's aides murmured quietly among themselves. Their skepticism eroded. Finally, Hargrove spoke. His voice was controlled but edged. Adequate, but physical standards still concern me. A soldier must carry a wounded comrade, must haul equipment, must endure pain. Lyric turned to him, her tone steady, respectful, but cutting through the air like steel. I agree, General. Physical strength remains essential, but we haven't lowered those standards. We've contextualized them. Look at the data. She tapped her tablet. On the screen, performance metrics appeared: endurance, strength, resilience. The recruits not only matched traditional averages, they exceeded them. The difference, Lyric continued, is that we've expanded what we measure. Strength of mind, strength of will, strength of adaptation. That doesn't weaken us, General, it makes us unstoppable. Hargrove stared at the data, silent. His aides leaned in, reading carefully. At last, he said, I will need to verify these numbers independently. Of course, Lyric replied instantly. Transparency is the foundation of this program. For the first time, he looked directly at her. His eyes were hard, but something behind them had shifted. Not acceptance, not agreement, but doubt, the first crack in certainty. Wren leaned close to Lyric as Hargrove turned away. You managed that better than I expected. Lyric's answer was quiet. He isn't convinced, not yet, but he's questioning, that's enough. Wren nodded. Questioning is the first step to change. That evening, the recruits sat around the barracks, buzzing with energy. They had felt it. They had known eyes were on them, the weight of judgment heavy as armor, and they had not broken. Orion approached Lyric as she packed her notes for the day. His voice was uncertain but steady. They're making me an instructor. Lyric didn't look up. I know, I recommended you. Orion blinked. Me, but I was, he stopped, swallowing. I was everything you stood against. That's why you'll be effective, Lyric said. You know both sides, you've lived the arrogance. Now you've tasted humility, that makes you valuable. Understanding dawned slowly across his face. That's why you waited 3 weeks before you fought Varga, isn't it? You weren't just teaching us, you were teaching him. Lyric finally looked at him, her eyes calm, unwavering. Change doesn't come from outside, Tavish. It happens when the inside is forced to see differently. Orion nodded, the weight of it settling in his chest. He wouldn't let her down. But while recruits celebrated and instructors debated, the higher halls of command were far from convinced. General Hargrove returned to headquarters with notes, observations, and doubts carved deep into his mind. And as he entered the strategy chamber, another voice waited, colder, sharper, more dangerous than his own. A shadow in uniform leaned forward, whispering words that turned skepticism into something harder. Not resistance, but war. And Lyric Blackwood's name was spoken with the venom of an enemy target. What happens when the enemy isn't across the battlefield, but seated at your own table? 6 weeks after the mud, the bruise of Varga's humiliation had faded, replaced by something unexpected. Respect, even admiration. Where recruits once saw him as a brute hammering weakness out of them, now they saw a man who demanded more than muscle, a man willing to change. And the recruits themselves had changed. Juniper had become the quiet tactician of the group, her maps and strategies saving her team in scenario after scenario. Everlai's memory turned intelligence drills into showcases of precision. Even Orion, once the loudest, strongest, most certain of his place, now listened first, acted second. They had become a unit. And that terrified people. Colonel Wren's office felt heavier than usual when Lyric entered. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He handed her a slim folder, his expression taut. She flipped it open. General Hargrove's memorandum. Words circled in red, underlined in anger. The reforms at Fort Blackwood constitute an unacceptable risk. This so-called broadening of standards dilutes combat effectiveness. Colonel Blackwood is destabilizing discipline and morale. Recommend immediate review for potential termination of program. Lyric closed the folder, slowly. Wren leaned forward. He's organizing resistance, not whispers, formal, coordinated. She said nothing, but the silence carried weight. Wren continued, and he's not alone. Several high-ranking officers are aligning with him. They believe tradition is safer than innovation. Lyric's eyes narrowed slightly. Safer for who? Wren studied her. For them. For the system that made them. You're threatening more than training, Blackwood. You're threatening an identity they've built their careers on. Lyric set the folder down. Her voice was calm. Then the war has already begun. That evening the recruits faced their hardest exercise yet. Simulated insurgency in an occupied village. It wasn't brute combat. It was choices. Every corner hid a moral test, a frightened civilian, an ambiguous ally, an enemy disguised as one of their own. Varga oversaw from the edge of the field. His voice barked commands, but his eyes tracked differently now, searching not for muscle, but for thought. When Orion hesitated at a doorway, uncertain if the woman clutching a child was a threat, Juniper's voice cut through. Hold, look at her hands. She's signaling. Orion froze, looked again. A trigger wire in her sleeve, a trap. He exhaled, backed off. They diffused it without loss. Varga's jaw tightened, pride, a different kind than before. By the end, the recruits had secured the village with fewer casualties than any class in recent history. Wren's assessment team applauded. The data was clear. But beyond the fence, shadows gathered. 2 nights later, in a dim conference hall far from Fort Blackwood, Hargrove stood at the head of a polished table, surrounded by officers whose stars glittered brighter than their convictions. This is unacceptable, he snapped, slamming a report down. Blackwood's methods are spreading. Already Fort Ravenna has requested pilot programs. If this continues, we'll breed hesitation, softness, soldiers second-guessing orders in combat. An admiral shifted uneasily. With respect, General, the data shows improved adaptability. Data doesn't bleed, Hargrove cut him off. Men do. Wars are not won by overthinking. They're won by breaking the enemy before the enemy breaks you. Blackwood is poisoning the well. His words hung heavy. Fear flickered in some eyes, agreement in others. One voice broke the silence, cold, calculated. Then break her program, force it to fail in front of them. Hargrove's lips curled into something dangerous. And the plan began. Back at Fort Blackwood, Lyric walked the perimeter at dawn. The recruits drilled in the yard, their shouts carried on the wind. She paused as Varga joined her, his face damp with sweat from running before sunrise. "They're better," he said simply, nodding toward the recruits. "Not softer, not weaker, better, stronger in ways I didn't see before." Lyric didn't respond at once. Her eyes stayed on the recruits, her expression unreadable. Finally she said, "Then you've learned the hardest lesson, Sergeant." Varga tilted his head. "Which is?" "That strength isn't what you can break, it's what you can build." He stood quietly with her, the words settling into the silence between them. For a man who had spent his life measuring strength by dominance, it was a revelation heavier than any rucksack. But the cracks showed soon after. A supply shipment was delayed inexplicably. Ammunition for drills rerouted. Simulation tech accidentally reassigned to another base. And when Wren pressed higher command for explanations, he was met with polite denials and cold indifference. Sabotage. The message was clear. If they couldn't discredit Blackwood with words, they would force her program to fail with missing tools, broken drills, and half-prepared recruits. Lyric saw it, felt it, and for the first time since the mud, a flicker of doubt passed through her chest. What if they were right? What if she was weakening the very force she wanted to strengthen? That night she sat alone in her quarters, staring at her hands, the same hands that had once disarmed an enemy in the shadows of a foreign city. She remembered the whisper in her ear, "Mission complete, Agent Blackwood." She had never doubted herself then, not in foreign lands, not in silence and shadows. But this wasn't foreign, this wasn't shadows, this was home. And home could be crueler. The next morning, Colonel Wren entered her office. He closed the door behind him, his face grave. "They're sending Hargrove back," he said. "Not for observation this time, for trial." Lyric's brows tightened. "Trial?" Wren nodded. "A full combat demonstration. Live fire, high risk. If your recruits fail, your program ends permanently." Lyric's silence stretched. Wren leaned on the desk, his voice quiet but urgent. "They want you to break. They've stacked the deck. If you lose, they'll bury your reforms so deep no one will try again for 50 years. Her hands folded calmly, but her pulse pounded. "Then," she said softly, "we don't lose." Wren studied her face. No fear, no hesitation, only certainty, the same certainty he'd seen in the mud when she flipped a man twice her size without blinking. He exhaled slowly. "Then we prepare." That night, as the recruits lay in their bunks, the storm gathered outside. Wind howled against the barracks. Juniper whispered across to Everly, her voice laced with nerves. "Do you think we're ready?" Everly turned on her side, staring into the dark. "We'd better be, because this isn't just about us anymore. It's about everyone who'll come after." From the corner of the barracks, Orion's voice broke in, steady now where once it had been cocky. "We'll be ready, because she's ready, and if she believes we can do this, then we can." The silence after his words was different, not fear, not doubt. Resolve. Far above, in an office lit by a single lamp, Hargrove read through the exercise design one last time. A trial meant to break them. Unfair, unforgiving, unwinnable. He smiled. By the end of tomorrow, Blackwood's reforms would be nothing but a footnote. Or so he believed. Lyric stood alone in the training yard that night, the storm tearing at her uniform, the mud sucking at her boots. She looked out at the grounds where everything had begun, where she had once lain, humiliated in the dirt. Her breath was steady, her voice a whisper. Let them come. Because she knew something Hargrove never would. Strength doesn't come from certainty. It comes from surviving doubt. And waiting. Always waiting. For the precise moment to strike. What happens when the test is designed for you to lose? The morning broke with a strange quiet, the kind of silence that makes soldiers uneasy. No rain, no wind, just a heavy stillness hanging over Fort Blackwood as if the sky itself was holding its breath. The recruits lined up in formation, their faces pale but set. This wasn't training anymore. This was judgment. From the observation platform, General Hargrove stood like a statue carved from stone, his eyes fixed coldly on the field below. Behind him, a cadre of officers and aides took notes, whispering predictions of failure. Beside them, Colonel Wren kept his expression neutral, and a step back, Lyric Blackwood stood with hands folded, her eyes steady. She didn't need to speak. The recruits could feel her presence, even from a distance. The horn blared, and the trial began. The scenario was brutal from the first step. A full-scale combat simulation with live rounds, explosive charges, and no margin for error. The recruits were dropped into a maze of ruined buildings, smoke grenades flooding the air, enemy drones buzzing overhead. They had to infiltrate, secure hostages, neutralize threats, and extract, all while carrying packs twice the usual weight. Unwinnable by design. Or so it seemed. Juniper Frost took point, her eyes darting across crumbling walls, tracing lines of cover others missed. Left flank, 2 drones overhead, she whispered into the comms. Orion Tavish shifted his bulk forward, shielding the smaller recruits as they advanced. For the first time, his strength was used not for glory, but for protection. Everly Quinn hunched over a portable console, fingers flying as she jammed enemy drone signals, her lips pressed tight with concentration. They moved as a unit, not flawless, not perfect, but adaptive. And that made them dangerous. From above, Hargrove's jaw tightened. "They're hesitating," he snapped. "A real unit would have stormed that building already." Wren kept his voice level. "They're calculating risk, minimizing loss." "War is loss," Hargrove barked. "You break the enemy before they break you." Lyric finally spoke, her tone calm but unyielding. "You break the enemy by outlasting them, by outthinking them. Watch." Hargrove glared at her, but his attention snapped back to the field as gunfire erupted. The recruits had triggered the first ambush. Dozens of enemies poured from the buildings, their rifles barking. Live rounds cut the air, too close for comfort. Orion roared, pulling a fallen recruit to cover. Juniper mapped their retreat in seconds, her voice sharp. Back alley, 2 turns, crossfire trap at the 3rd corner. They moved as she directed, ducking, weaving, barely a step ahead of the kill zone. Everly's voice crackled through the comms. "Hostage building has 4 heat signatures on the roof, 2 more at ground level." "How do you know?" Orion shouted over the noise. "I don't," she admitted, "but the signal interference suggests it. Trust me." He did, without hesitation. They adjusted course. And when they breached, Everly was right. Above, Hargrove's aides exchanged uneasy looks. The recruits weren't supposed to be this effective. "Luck," Hargrove muttered, though his voice had lost some certainty. Wren glanced sideways at him but said nothing. Lyric's gaze stayed fixed on the field, her face calm but her eyes burning. The second phase was worse. Communications failed, not by accident, by design. The recruits' radios went dead, leaving them isolated in the chaos. For a moment panic rippled. Orion barked orders unheard. Everly slammed her console, powerless. But then Juniper raised her hand silently, signaling with gestures. One by one they fell into rhythm, improvised hand signs, nods, glances. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. They adapted. From above, Wren allowed the faintest smile. Hargrove, however, slammed his fist against the rail. "This is a controlled drill. They shouldn't be improvising their own system." Lyric turned her head slightly. "And yet they are. Isn't that the point?" Hargrove's glare could have cut glass. The final phase hit harder than any before. Explosives detonated unexpectedly, collapsing half the mock village. Dust and smoke engulfed the recruits, cutting off vision, disorienting every sense. The hostages screamed inside the rubble. The timer ticked down mercilessly. Orion shouldered debris until his muscles tore, sweat pouring down his face. Juniper navigated through collapsing hallways with uncanny instinct, leading them to safety. Everly bypassed a digital lock on the fly, her fingers shaking, her mind running faster than her pulse. One recruit, Zephyr, the smallest of them all, rigged a makeshift lever out of pipes to free a pinned comrade. They were battered, exhausted, bloodied. But they didn't break. Not once. From the platform, the officers stared. The impossible trial was being beaten before their eyes. Hargrove's face had gone pale beneath his fury. No, no, they're supposed to fail, they have to fail. Wren's voice was quiet but cutting. Then perhaps your definition of failure needs to change. Lyric finally stepped forward, her voice carrying softly across the platform. You wanted proof, General, there it is. Not in their strength alone, not in their speed, but in their refusal to surrender. That's what wins wars, not tradition, not pride, this. Her hand gestured toward the recruits, staggering, coughing, but still moving forward. Still standing. The horn blared. The exercise ended. The recruits collapsed to their knees, gasping for breath, their faces streaked with sweat and dust. But the hostages were secured, the mission completed. Against every odd, against every trap, against a system built for their failure. They had won. The silence on the platform was deafening. Finally Hargrove spoke, his voice strangled with fury. This proves nothing. They bent the rules, improvised. Real combat is. Lyric cut him off, her tone quiet but sharp as a blade. Real combat is improvisation, General, and if you don't see that, you've already lost. Hargrove's face darkened. His mouth opened, ready to strike back when Wren's hand raised. That's enough. His voice carried the weight of command. Even Hargrove fell silent. The recruits below looked up, their eyes wide, their chests heaving. They didn't know yet if they had saved the program. But they knew this much. They hadn't failed themselves. That night the barracks was silent. Not celebration, not relief, just silence. The kind that comes after surviving something designed to break you. Orion lay staring at the ceiling, his arms bandaged, his body aching. We shouldn't have made it. Juniper's voice whispered back, but we did. Everly rolled onto her side, clutching her pillow. What happens now? Lyric, standing quietly in the doorway, answered them softly. Now we wait. Her eyes were steady, but her heart knew the truth. This wasn't the end. The real battle had only just begun. How do you measure victory when the field itself was built for your failure? The horn still echoed in their ears long after it stopped. Smoke drifted across the mock battlefield, curling through shafts of sunlight. The recruits lay scattered, gasping, clutching their rifles as if the ground itself might rip them away. Their bodies trembled with exhaustion, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had survived. They had secured the hostages. They had completed the mission. Against odds, no one expected them to overcome. Orion's chest rose and fell like a drum, his arms streaked with cuts, his shoulders trembling from the weight of stone he'd carried. Juniper crouched with her map tablet still clutched in one hand, knuckles white. Everly wiped grit from her face, blinking hard against the sting of smoke. For a moment there was no cheer, no celebration, just silence. The kind of silence that comes after staring death in the eye and walking past it. Then from the platform, a sharp voice cracked the air. This proves nothing. General Hargrove's words cut deeper than the trial itself. His face was tight, pale beneath his fury, his eyes locked on the recruits as though they had cheated him of something. Wren shifted at his side, his tone measured but firm. With respect, sir, they succeeded under conditions meant to ensure failure. That means something. It means chaos, Hargrove snapped. Improvisation is not strategy. You don't rewrite doctrine because a handful of recruits stumbled through an exercise. Lyric Blackwood stood silent, hands folded behind her back, her eyes fixed not on Hargrove but on the recruits below. They had given everything, and yet she knew this wasn't over. Their battle was only half won. Because the hardest wars weren't fought in mud or fire. They were fought in rooms filled with polished tables, cold eyes, and sharpened words. Later in the barracks, the recruits sat in silence, each lost in thought. Orion's bandages wrapped tight around his forearms. Juniper traced invisible lines across her knee, her mind still mapping the exercise over and over. Everly stared at the ceiling, lips moving as if replaying comms signals in her head. Finally, Orion broke the silence. "We shouldn't have made it." Juniper glanced up, her voice quiet but steady. "But we did." Everly's throat tightened. "Doesn't matter, they'll say it wasn't real, that it doesn't count." From the doorway, Lyric's voice entered like a soft blade. "What matters is that you know it counts, that you stood, that you refused to break. Everything else is politics." They looked at her, waiting for more. But she said nothing else. Because she knew, soldiers carried truth in their bodies, but politics carried lies in their teeth. And the lies were sharpening. At headquarters, Hargrove wasted no time. The very night of the trial, he convened allies in a low-lit chamber, a table strewn with files and steaming cups of untouched coffee. "She embarrassed us," he growled, slamming a palm against the table. "In front of officers, in front of recruits. If we allow this experiment, it spreads." A colonel with silver hair frowned. "But the data, sir, it shows improved survival rates, better adaptability." "Adaptability breeds hesitation," Hargrove snapped. "Hesitation kills." A younger officer shifted in his seat. "With respect, sir, they didn't hesitate, they adapted. There's a difference." Hargrove's glare froze him silent. "Listen well," he continued, his voice low, venomous. "Blackwood isn't just changing training. She's changing the very definition of soldier. If she wins, the world changes, and men like us," he leaned closer, "we vanish." Silence fell across the room, not agreement, not rejection, just fear. The kind of fear that fuels destruction. And so the orders were whispered, supplies to be cut, evaluations rewritten, stories planted. Not war, not yet. But sabotage. Lyric felt it almost immediately. The next morning, critical reports went missing. Requests for new equipment were denied with vague excuses. Recruits were suddenly reassigned to clerical tasks instead of drills. Wren stormed into her office, slamming a thin folder onto her desk. "Look at this. They've changed the evaluation metrics. Now half the criteria are things you don't even train, arbitrary measures designed to make them fail." Lyric flipped through the pages, her jaw tightening. "They're rewriting the game." Wren's voice rose. "They want you cornered. They want you discredited so badly that no one will ever try reforms again." For the first time, Lyric's hands trembled slightly as she closed the folder. She sat still for a long moment, eyes lowered. Then she whispered, "We fight anyway." Wren sighed, rubbing his temples. "You can't outfight a system with grit alone. They'll bury you under paperwork, under protocol. You know this." Lyric raised her eyes, calm, steady. "Then we don't fight with grit, we fight with truth." That evening, Varga found her alone in the training yard, the sun bleeding low against the horizon. He walked with a limp, an old injury aggravated during the trial, but his eyes were clear. "You should know," he said, his voice rough. "They're calling you reckless, saying you put the recruits at risk." Lyric didn't look at him. "They were always at risk, that's what training is, what life is." Varga exhaled slowly, crossing his arms. I used to think strength was about crushing, about proving you're harder than the dirt, but when I saw them in that trial, his voice caught just for a moment. It wasn't your strength I saw, it was theirs, and it came from you. Lyric turned her head slightly, studying him. You changed, Sergeant. He gave a dry, humorless chuckle. Maybe I finally saw what I didn't want to. Strength isn't what you break, it's what you build. For a long time, they stood in silence, the last light of day stretching shadows across the yard. Then Lyric said softly, "Then stand with me, because they'll try to break what we built, and I can't hold it alone." Varga nodded, no hesitation. "I'm with you." But as night fell, a letter arrived, stamped with the seal of command. Cold words etched across the page, program under formal review, all operations suspended pending inquiry. Lyric read it in silence. The war had just changed. This time it wasn't mud or bullets. It was ink. And ink could bleed just as deeply. What do you do when the system itself has decided you must fail? Lyric Blackwood sat in the cold silence of the inquiry chamber. The walls were tall, windowless, painted in lifeless gray that swallowed warmth. A polished table stretched between her and the men who had gathered to dismantle everything she had built. At its head sat General Hargrove, his medals catching the sterile light, his eyes harder than the steel fixtures around them. Colonel Wren stood quietly behind Lyric's chair. Varga sat in the back row, shoulders squared, his presence more silent promise than protection. And scattered across the gallery benches, the recruits, Orion, Juniper, Everlie, Zephyr, were there. Bruised, bandaged, still marked from the trial, but unwilling to be anywhere else. The inquiry began not with words, but with silence, that long, heavy silence meant to intimidate. Finally, Hargrove leaned forward. "This program," he said, his voice a low growl, "is reckless. It endangers lives, undermines discipline, and dilutes the standards that have held our forces together for generations. You," his finger stabbed the air toward Lyric, "are responsible." The words carried like bullets across the table. Lyric didn't flinch. She folded her hands, met his eyes, calm, steady. "General," she said quietly, "what endangers lives is training soldiers to break instead of bend. What undermines discipline is humiliation disguised as strength. And what dilutes standards is ignoring the reality of modern war." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some officers looked away, uncomfortable. Others leaned in, eager for the clash. Hargrove's jaw tightened. "Your recruits survived one trial by improvisation and luck. That is not doctrine, that is chaos." Lyric let the silence breathe before she answered. "Chaos is the battlefield, General. If we cannot train for it, we prepare for nothing." The inquiry dragged on. Hours of accusations, charts twisted to look like failures, anecdotes wielded like weapons. Hargrove brought witness after witness. Men and women loyal to his way, each painting Lyric as dangerous, her methods untested, her reforms a threat to the fabric of discipline. She answered calmly, never raising her voice. But the weight was immense. Even Wren leaned close at one point, whispering, "They've stacked it too heavily. They want blood, not truth." Lyric's eyes flickered toward the recruits. Their faces were pale, tense. They weren't supposed to be here. Recruits had no place in inquiry chambers. But they had come anyway, sitting in silence, carrying the weight of what she had given them. And then, unexpectedly, Varga stood. The room stilled. Hargrove's glare snapped toward him. "You are not scheduled to testify." Varga's voice rumbled steady. "Then schedule me now." Before Hargrove could bark an order, Wren's voice cut through. "He has standing, General. He was there from the start. His perspective has weight." Grudgingly, Hargrove waved a hand. "Speak, briefly." Varga stepped forward, every eye on him. He had once been the embodiment of Hargrove's philosophy, brute force, humiliation as teaching, dominance as proof of strength. The irony was not lost on the chamber. He cleared his throat. "I've broken recruits. I've bled them, buried them in the mud, told them if they couldn't crawl out, they didn't deserve the uniform. I believed it. I lived it." A pause, his voice softened, rough with memory. "And then I met her." He gestured toward Lyric. "I slammed her into the dirt in front of everyone. I thought I'd shown weakness. But when she stood, when she turned what I gave her into fire, I realized it wasn't weakness at all. It was strength I couldn't see." He turned slowly, facing the gathered officers. "You can call her reckless. You can say her methods are dangerous, but I've seen the other way. I've lived it. And I'll tell you this, she doesn't weaken soldiers. She forges them. I'd take her recruits into battle before I'd take 100 of mine." The silence that followed was heavy, unsettled. Even Hargrove looked momentarily shaken. But then his voice snapped like a whip. "Emotional testimony, nothing more. The battlefield doesn't care about feelings." But that was when Orion stood. The gallery stirred as the young recruit stepped forward, face still bandaged, body still aching. His voice wasn't polished, but it carried a raw weight. "You say the battlefield doesn't care about feelings, General. You're right. It doesn't. But feelings are what made me pick up the man next to me when he fell. Feelings are what made me take a bullet so someone smaller could survive. Feelings are why I'm standing here instead of buried in the ground." Juniper rose next, her voice quieter but cutting. "If we hadn't adapted, we'd all be dead. The old way would have broken us. She built us. That's why we lived." Everlive followed, her words trembling but fierce. "You can erase her reports. You can burn her data, but you can't erase us. We're the proof, and we're standing right here." The recruits' voices wove together, one after another, until the chamber wasn't filled with officers anymore, but with the undeniable presence of those who had been through fire and refused to vanish. Lyric didn't move, didn't speak. She let them carry the truth. Because it wasn't hers anymore, it was theirs. Hargrove's fury burned in his eyes, but for the first time his words faltered. His allies shifted uncomfortably, their certainty shaken. Data could be argued, protocol could be twisted, but living proof, bruised, battered, unbroken proof, could not be erased. Finally, Hargrove hissed through clenched teeth. "This inquiry is not decided by sentiment." Wren stepped forward, his voice firm, echoing across the chamber. "No, General, it's decided by truth, and you've just heard it." The presiding officer, older than Hargrove, his voice tired but clear, banged the gavel. "This chamber will deliberate." The session adjourned. Outside, the recruits clustered around Lyric, their faces anxious. Orion's voice cracked with nerves. "Did we do enough?" Lyric studied them, her expression softening for the first time. "You did more than enough. You proved what they could not deny." Everlie's eyes glistened. "But what if they bury it anyway?" Lyric touched her shoulder gently. "Then you carry it, and you pass it on, because strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it survives in silence, waiting for its moment." 2 days later, the decision came. The reforms would not be dismantled. They would continue under review, expanded in trial programs across select bases. Not a full victory, not absolute, but survival. And in survival there was hope. Hargrove's face, as the decision was read, was thunderous. His empire of certainty had cracked. He stormed from the chamber without a word, his metals clattering faintly against his chest. Wren exhaled, his shoulders easing for the first time in weeks. "You won," he said quietly. Lyric shook her head. "We didn't win, we endured, that's different." He studied her, and sometimes endurance is the greatest victory of all. Weeks later, Fort Blackwood returned to rhythm. Drills, marches, sweat, but there was something new in the air, not arrogance, not fear. Dignity. Varga trained recruits with a steadier hand, his barks carrying not just demand but belief. Orion mentored younger cadets, teaching them the lesson he had learned too late. Listen first, act second. Juniper's strategies became part of the curriculum, Everly's memory exercises adopted as standard. And Lyric walked among them, quiet, observant. She no longer needed to prove herself. The proof was alive, breathing, running laps in the yard, carrying each other when they stumbled. She would not be remembered as the woman who fought in the mud or stood in defiance of generals. She would be remembered as the woman who redefined strength. Not by breaking, by building. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the yard in gold, Lyric paused by the very patch of dirt where it had begun, where Varga had once slammed her down before the eyes of strangers. She knelt, pressing her palm lightly against the ground. It was cool, solid, unmoving. But she smiled, because she knew the truth. The dirt had not broken her. It had crowned her. And as the recruits ran drills around her, their voices carrying across the fatting light, Lyric Blackwood rose, turned, and walked forward without a word. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.